Everybody, welcome back to Final Resonance TV and episode number 5 of Van Halen Stories. Today, my guests are Brad Tolinski. You probably know him from Guitar World for 2 decades, and Chris Gill, who is also a journalist and a guitar journalist for Guitar Player, right? And Guitar World, and Guitar Aficionado. And Brad was involved with Guitar Aficionado as an editor, right?
I created sort of that magazine conceptually.
Okay.
And but we had a couple of really great editors afterwards, and Chris being one of them.
Okay, so yeah, we're totally familiar with everything you guys are doing. I mean, I've seen you guys at the NAMM show year after year. We just never spoke and been in the same circles. But certainly, I came from the retail side of the business, so that's kind of where I kind of saw you guys there. Cool. But anyway, your new book, let's get into that. This book is really great. It's one of the things that I noticed right away was the layout of the way you guys put it together. And you started out with the Eddie's Oddities, right? And then you had a flow which started with like the story itself, an actual book flow, and then you went into these interviews that were put together. One of the things I noticed about the interviews, they filled in a lot of holes for me, even things I didn't know. For the very first thing that I noticed was Eddie's father's trajectory from Holland to Indonesia, back to Holland, back to the United States.
Yeah,
that I had no clue about. So, how did you guys backfill some of these details?
Well, that was a lot of research. Some of it I got from Ed himself. Mm-hmm. Through our interviews, but to be honest with you, I hadn't really been able to pull together the entire story of that until I started really doing the research for the book. A lot of the stuff comes out of like, what don't I know? Like you go to write something and then you realize, gee, there's a big hole right there. There's a big gap. Yeah. And, I found some of it through, going deep in the internet. Some of it was basically from Dutch newspapers, talking about Ed and talking about the family. And obviously there was a lot of, pride in Holland about the Van Halen story. And they were more apt to give the background than American publications.
Yeah, I said that Eddie, he would allude to some of those things of the early life of his father and his mother, but never quite fully fleshed that out, and you guys did that. So
I think that's actually, if I might say, like one of the strengths of this book is that, or one of our goals too, was to sort of straighten out a lot of the timelines and misconceptions, not only about Eddie's life, but also about his various creations. As you know, we did a super deep dive into the origins of the Frankenstein and like where Ed really started doing tapping and some of these other things that have just been turned into myth. But some of it, nobody really bothered to research and find out when all these things really happened.
Right. There was some really interesting detail. I'm not going to give it away about his father in World War II that I did not know, and that was a surprise. So, yeah, I didn't say it before, but the book's called Eddie Van Halen: Eruption Conversations with Eddie Van Halen, and it uncovers some cool things that I'd never realized. One of my fan questions, somebody asked me about your book, is would you be doing any signings anywhere? And this was from a person out in California in Bakersfield.
We hope to. I mean, it's hard to set up now. Things are so different nowadays.
Sure, right.
So I have a bookstore. I'm up in northern New Jersey, just outside of New York City, and there's a great bookstore up near me that does signings all the time, at least used to. I haven't really checked to see, but we need to kind of hash that out with our publisher and see what they're willing to do, and just it's something we've never done. We've gone on tour as musicians, but to go on tour as book writers is a whole different gig,
Right.
Well, Chris and I have discussed that because we've been getting a lot of requests for signed books, and we're trying to sort out a solution. Chris, I've actually got some developments.
Okay, cool.
Talk to you about that might make it very easy for us to take care of that. So we're working on it. I guess keep checking Chris and my Facebook and Instagram for more details.
Okay, great, yeah. And one of the great things about your book is the Ross Halfin photograph. That you guys have. I've had that on my wall for, I think it was Guitar One. You guys have mentioned some. I don't know if you had any affiliation with Guitar One, but
we did, yeah.
So Guitar One had a spread years ago of that photo, a big photo, poster version of that.
Well, Ross is a pretty good friend of mine. He's been a good friend for, good couple decades, and did many photo shoots for Guitar World. Many of these beautiful covers that we did in Guitar World were product of Ross Halfin's photography.
Yeah.
Almost any picture of Metallica or Jimmy Page that you see is a lot of that's with Ross. And we were looking for an image that would just say a lot for the cover and about the kind of respect that we were trying to give Ed as a musician.
Right.
We didn't want, something super garish. We wanted something that looked monumental as his genius. And I just love that shot because you could see so clearly his tapping and the muscularity sort of his fingers when he did this. Chris and I have been talking a lot about that. And when we would go and hang out at 5150 and see and visit with Ed, a lot of times he would pick up a guitar and he would play. It wouldn't be plugged in necessarily, but he would pick up a guitar and start playing. And that's something that, as a guitarist, you would know and appreciate. Just how Ed didn't play the guitar casually almost ever. I didn't see him. Like when he picked it up, he just went for it and played. And it was so loud sometimes it'd be almost like an acoustic guitar. He would play with so much force. And, this picture just captured that for me. Like if you look at his fingers, and also just the deep concentration in his face while he was doing it.
Yeah, that you guys were talking about his hand size and all that the other day about his hands. And all the years of talking about his development as a pianist when he was young, he was very young. Obviously got the hand straight from that. In your book, he even talks about his hands a little bit about, his ability to stretch them and, and all that. So he had very dexterous hands. But when I actually measured his hands, in the rock walk out in California, they're the same size as my hand. No, nothing particularly, huge. And like Steve Vai has very long fingers, and you guys know this.
Paul Gilbert.
Yeah.
They wrap around the guitar neck three times, I think.
Freaky. These guys have something to have freaky hands. They do, but Edward Van Halen's hands were not huge. Yeah. Apparently very strong. One of the other things I want to ask you is about the pick. This is a weird thing about, somebody like Yngwie versus Eddie, is how did he do this with such a thin pick?
Force. Part of it was holding it with the middle finger. That was his base, and he'd used the forefinger for a little bit of extra support. Then he could tap, But really with Ed, it was force. I mean, and he didn't always use a thin pick. He kind of changed gauges quite a bit, although I never really knew him to use a heavy. But he'd go to a medium, between like a medium and a thin pick. Okay. But I think that was just part of it was getting that snap, the precision.
That's the thing is that doesn't get talked about. It's almost a cliche in guitar magazines. Oh, all you guys want to do is talk about picks and strings. Right. Well, picks and strings are pretty damn important.
Right. That's the direct conduit. That's where it begins. It begins with the pick, and then it hits the string, and then it goes through everything else.
Right.
And I have to say for myself personally, although I tend to use mediums, I have used thins. And it affects even the EQ. Right. So to me, like there's a certain kind of clarity and as Chris says, a snap that you get out of a thin pick that you just don't get out of a heavy pick. I'm sorry,
Right. Then you see somebody like Brian May using a sixpence or Yngwie using
Billy Gibbons.
Yeah, they all use these huge picks, and it's an interesting subject in the way that it feels on your. You guys know this from when you're picking. The connection to the string is a totally different feel with a light pick as a heavy pick, and
sure,
I guess it's the stylistic thing with like Yngwie, where he's kind of he's using a lot of legato and he's pushing a lot with that pick, whereas Eddie was kind of picking everything. Not everything.
Eddie is a much different.
Touch.
Yeah, Eddie's a much different player than Yngwie.
Sure.
Yeah, very different, almost opposite, really.
Yeah, the way it attack.
Yngwie tried to show me how he does this thing because he can't explain it. So I was, he got me like right up with him, like like when you're trying to teach a girl how to play pool or something like that. Almost, I'm looking at him. It's just it's super light sweep. I'm just like, I can't do that. I'm not wired to do that. I've never been able to do sweep picking. I can do a little flourish, but I can't do the up and down. It's just, but it's just a super light touch. And I don't know, there's something said about how Yngwie makes those notes pop, which is just brilliant. Yeah. But it's completely the opposite of Ed. I learned the Eddie Van Halen way. It's just like wrench whatever you can out of the guitar and wear those frets down till they're nothing,
Right.
Eddie's more like Buddy Guy than he is Yngwie Malmsteen.
Yeah.
Right. Well, would you say like in the early days though, and I want to talk about the amp too in a minute, but in the early days with less gain, you guys talk about this a little bit, that sometimes that what came from his hands, that snap, that attack, was part of that sound that we loved on Van Halen 1, Van Halen 2.
My going comment is Ed was his own overdrive pedal. He didn't need an overdrive pedal. He was the overdrive pedal, because there was so much output coming from the force that he put onto the strings through the pickup and everything that you're already talking about a lot more voltage, coming through just as a result of that. Right. Again, people always say like, oh, I've got the rig. I've plugged into a plexi, like a late 60s plexi. And it doesn't sound like that. No, the amp had to be modified. It's like the modification was Ed, that's what it was. It was Ed, he could drive that amp really hard.
Yeah. I've seen interviews of him when he's playing without an amp, and you can hear that snap and that attack that he had.
That's another thing I've always said is like 90% of Ed's tone started there. Yeah. I've heard Ed play unplugged, many times. And it's just like, there's that sound. There's that personality. There's the Eddie Van Halen Brown sound, even though he later revised that to say it was about Alex's snare drum, but it's still, there's that sound, it comes from the person, the heart, the fingers, the brain.
One of the, if you go back to those, there was an interview, I don't know whether it's Stephen Rosen or I think it was Stephen, where he's playing acoustic on the electric guitar in the interview.
Yeah.
You can hear his hands, you could hear the articulation being exactly what you hear when it's electrified.
Exactly. You just make it louder,
It's an amazing thing about him. One of the things we have to do to pre-qualify you two guys is we have to ask the question, what is your favorite Van Halen song, which I kind of know already, but I didn't hear this from anywhere else. Your favorite solo and your favorite Eddie guitar. So favorite song, favorite solo, favorite Eddie guitar.
I guess I'll start. I'll give Brad a little time to think. As I've said many a time, Girl Gone Bad's my all-time favorite song. I mean, it does change from time to time. There's other stuff that I like better, but that one just kind of it always punches me. And it's funny because I didn't really like it initially a lot. It was one of those songs that I was like, yeah, it's cool, but over time, it really grew on me. I think part of it, what got me too, was when there's that bootleg that came out of just hearing him and Alex working the song out. And it's about 15, 20 minutes of them just going over it over and over again. And that's where I started to pick up on a lot of nuances and things that I kind of maybe, just overlooked for whatever reason. But yeah, I think it's just a brilliant tour de force performance by Ed. It covers so many different things, so many different dynamics. It's got the harmonics, it's got the whammy bar stuff, it's got this crazy solo, it's got a great riff. Just to me, it's kind of the complete package. Favorite solo? Well, come on, Eruption. I mean, that's ground zero. That's just, he did great solos on a lot of songs. I mean, I'm the One, I love what he does on there too. Right. I love what he does on Fire. I mean, anything on the first album, just awesome, and then you can go even on later through his work. I mean, just Ed always came up with great solos. I mean, every solo he played on Fair Warning, awesome. But Eruption, that's where, the hooks, he just laid the hooks into me and changed my life.
Yeah.
Just hearing that, like I said, I was fortunate enough to hear that album played on the radio the first day that it came out. And it just blew my 15-year-old little mind out the window.
Right.
I was already a guitar player. I was already studying all these other people. And then Ed came along and just, I thought I was a good player, you know.
Right.
Then I heard that and it's like, I've got a long way to go.
Right.
So, and the other thing is the sound of it. It sounds just more aggressive than anything out there. It still sounds amazing. You can hear it through the tiniest little AM radio speaker and it just sounds massive. So Eruption.
Still kicks ass. So
favorite guitar.
Yeah.
What do I pick? I mean, I Black and White Frankenstein, like the one behind you there.
Yeah.
Again, it's that first impression thing. It's your first love, you know. Just to me, that guitar just looks so damn cool. But in a different respect, I also love the one that's in the book, the Steinberger Les Paul.
Oh yeah,
it's just so wacky, you know. And it's just like, and then again, that's kind of like Latter Day Ed that I love. It's got the trans trim on it, you know. And it's a bit high tech, you know, and still just really cool.
Yeah, that is a cool guitar, and a cool story behind that as well in the book about what he used that on in your Eddie's Oddities sections that you did.
Yeah,
good story about what he played that on and the whole origin of that. That's really cool.
Plus, he played it on a great song, so I won't tell people which song it was, but he played it on a great song too.
Right. So, Brad.
Well, it all depends on my mood. When I feel like kicking ass, I'll go with Mean Streets every time.
Right.
But if I want to be in a good mood, I'll listen to Beautiful Girls.
Right.
And you know, I keep on using Beautiful Girls as sort of like a weird touchstone for me, because the whole time I was working on this book, you know, the analytical part of me was always had this question, like, what made Ed sound so different? And, you know, he's not a jazz player. He's not a blues player. He's not a rock player like Keith Richards. I mean, he doesn't use any of those licks that we associate with those genres.
Right.
He created this entirely new vocabulary. That's not, you know, what we think of when we think of blues scales or what we think of playing jazz. It's just totally whacked out. Mm-hmm. And to me, like, especially if you listen to the isolated version of Beautiful Girls, you hear it's almost like a one-man sound effects maker. I mean, just, you know, like, right. but it's done as in such a musical way, and it's done as commentary on David Lee Roth. And I say it's more like Carl Stalling and the music that he used to make for the Bugs Bunny cartoons than it is, you know, B.B. King or something like, you know, blues guys. Right. So those two songs reflect to me the two different sides of Ed. Now, solos, you know, people I think have probably grown when I say this, but I think the Beat It solo is really just another level of genius, again, in the sense of, like, how do you classify that solo? It almost sounds like, you know, I'm sorry to use more esoteric jazz, but it sounds more like if John Coltrane was sort of like brought into the middle of the world's biggest pop song.
Right.
It defies, you know, rhythmically, it's super interesting. The note choices are totally wacky. Mm-hmm. It's just this explosion of almost abstract sound in the middle of this pop song. And the fact that he could play something so profoundly weird in the middle of one of the biggest selling songs of all time, to me, and get away with it and have people go, oh my God.
Right.
Sort of sums up Ed to me, you know, in a nutshell. And the guitar, well, you know, I mean, the Frankenstein's sort of obvious, but Explorer is pretty freaking cool too.
That's true.
You know, and that was used as much, if not more, on the first record that everybody knows and loves. You know, so I got to put that guy way up there.
Yeah, right there is You Really Got Me, Hit the Scene. That was the guitar we heard.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's an amazing guitar, and he talked about that all through his career about how he messed that guitar up and everything. But these replicas, they sound great.
Yeah.
I mean, it's amazing to me, but yeah,
I heard you, man. I heard you. You can do it. You can do it.
You heard me. Oh Lord,
do it.
All right. So we were over talking about his dad and all that. I'll get back to a little bit of that, and they're coming to the America story. Something that. I have had the opportunity to tour Pasadena and see all the sites related to Van Halen. I actually put a video out there called the Van Halen Trail.
Cool.
And in that video, I go to all the historical sites, the high school, the Pasadena City College, the Civic, all of that. And looking at David Lee Roth's home and their home at that point, it's such a contrast. And
yeah.
And when I think of these guys coming from Holland with $15 and a piano, and then not long after that, they're in David Lee Roth's giant mansion.
Yeah.
There's that huge difference between the two. And they're actually pretty close in as far as neighborhoods go. But, man, the culture shock thing that you guys and he talks about in this book, it must have been something that people really don't talk about is how much culture shock, with the language barrier and all of those things that he dealt with initially. It's just amazing to me. Just see all.
Yeah, I think a lot of what we tried to answer in this book is not just tell people like what happened in his career, but why it happened. Right. And the foundation of his relationships with all these people and why there might be conflict rather than saying, they had Ed had a falling out with this person over this song or whatever. It's never like that. The story's always much more complex. And Ed's an incredibly complex person. So, what you're getting at, what we talked about in the book is explored, like him coming to America, having a language barrier. And, that just caused an inherent sort of shyness and social anxiety with Ed.
Right.
It sort of turned him into a bit of an introvert, which in turn turned him into a great musician.
Right.
And for that reason, him and Dave were two incredibly talented people, but expressed themselves in totally different ways. And they were different culturally. So there were all these things. But like I said, you've seen the yin and yang symbol, right?
Yeah.
You have to have these two elements in order to create a dynamic whole.
Yeah.
And you see that time and time again in rock and roll history.
Sure.
How two opposites come together to, it creates this incredible friction, but it also creates a certain sort of complexity that comes through and originality in the music. And that's really, the story of Dave and Ed is they were these two opposites that drove each other nuts, but together that they made this incredibly entertaining whole.
Right.
It worked until it didn't.
They definitely drove each other nuts. I mean, I would love to. Go ahead, Chris.
Another thing to add is just Pasadena is also a character in this book, and I think a lot of people are going to miss this. Is just Ed was a product of Pasadena, and a lot of people don't know this about Los Angeles. They just kind of see this big sprawling area, but Pasadena is kind of like this odd island. It's up the hill from downtown, and it's kind of this little world unto itself. And you have a lot of the old California there. You have San Marino, like where Dr. Roth, had his mansion. That's that was like Bel Air or Beverly Hills back in the day. Okay. So you have all this old money and this old established thing, but it was also this haven for immigrants because of all the industry going on in the San Gabriel Valley, like we explained in the book. And you have just all these forces that came together that really made Ed into what he was, that he absorbed a lot of that vibe that was around him that he wouldn't have gotten if he, say, grew up at the beach in Santa Monica or something like that. Yeah. So it's important to understand that Pasadena is kind of a character as well.
Yeah, it's a beautiful place. I mean,
It is.
to me. I mean, and you know, I've been all over LA, but Pasadena, when I went there, I was just really surprised how wide, sprawling streets. You know, the idyllic area that it is. It seems.
Yeah.
And I thought it would be a beautiful place to grow up, actually. And,
Well, you know, but there is, again, we talk about it in the book too. It's all of that, but it did have its sort of dark side. I mean, Ed was put in a school that was segregated.
right.
And we don't really think about segregation as something that was going on in the 60s, but it was going on in the 60s.
Sure.
And because Ed couldn't speak English well, he was put in with a lot of the minority students and sort of left to be forgotten.
Yeah. He mentioned that later in, we're to talk about that the Smithsonian, you know, the thing that was there, that he talked about that in some detail. You know, let's talk about his character, the introvert. Years ago, I read a book by Jenny Boyd called Musicians in Tune. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that book.
Yeah.
Jenny Boyd, she was she the one that dated Eric Clapton, or was it her sister?
I think it was her sister that dated
Patty, yeah.
Patty Boyd, yeah.
Patty Boyd, right. And so anyway, this book that talks about the paths that musicians take, and one of the series that I do is called, on this channel, is Musical Journeys, and it's, you know, how do we become musicians? What is it that funnels us down into this path? And it seems that the shy, introverted style of Eddie Van Halen in his room, sitting there by himself, learning to play his guitar, is a very common theme within guitar playing community. Am I right on that?
I think you're right. Yeah. I mean, for me, it was like I grew up in this kind of agricultural area in between San Diego and Los Angeles, and we lived 6 miles from downtown. So the benefit of that for me was I could get an amplifier and turn it all the way up and never bother anybody. Right. Because my parents were off wherever, and I'd come home from school and just crank up the amp and just wail. But yeah, I spent a lot of hours myself just playing, you know, music by myself. I think with Ed, it took a deeper meaning though, because it was his link. This was his way of communicating, you know, before he really completely mastered English. Yeah. You know, this was his way of making friends. I mean, for me, it was a way to meet girls, you know, and I'm sure there was a bit of that for Ed as well, but it was just also his, you know, his social icebreaker, essentially.
Right.
And then he became really good at it. And we mentioned again in the book, all the hours that you need to put in, you know, to really become a master at it. And Ed did that and then some, you know, so it was just, it was interesting. I mean, I think it was a lot of this, you know, this was his way. He could talk to people and kind of, you know, find acceptance, but also just, he could kind of also just let himself escape, you know, and just like, he could just put himself into the instrument and just the outside world would disappear as well. And that's why I think he spent so much time in his bedroom and then later in 5150.
Right. And, you know, this, one of the things that I see in the book is OCD, his you know, his OCD disorder. But, you know, with that comes this incredible focus that goes along with that disorder.
Yeah.
And that's also talked about quite a bit in the book. And his repetitive thoughts that, what is it, Scotty Ross said, circling the airport is what I read. Right. Because he's constantly his mind's constantly moving. His personality really stands out in the way that he was able to create so focused, you know, but also the side effects of that, what happens with that, you know, that those things that go along with it. So his bedroom, you guys made this thing where his bedroom became 5150 kind of. It was like a habitation. And one of the interesting things about Eddie, and I know a lot of folks who've met him over the years, he always had this weird thing where he would like invite people over. He would just, like, if you were in his circle or if you were on tour with him, or maybe you weren't like you guys in his inner circle, but you were on tour with him, he'd invite you over to the house and you could just call up and show up. Why do you think he did that so readily to just about any guitar player that he shared the stage or the, you know, show with?
Well, I think that, you know, Ed was inherently sort of an introverted personality.
Yeah.
And also had problems with, you know, some social interactions. But he felt comfortable once he was in his home space. And I always felt that he was he wasn't just looking for connections. He was looking for deeper connections. Right. So it wasn't so much like he didn't like to talk to people. It was much that, just like everything else he did, he wanted to have a real conversation. There was an intensity about his social interactions that, let's face it, when you go out to a nightclub or you go out to a bar or you go out to the Rainbow or whatever it is, that's not what you're going to get. It's going to be this casual, this, that, the other thing. Ed wasn't really about that. He wanted to know something about you. He wanted to be able to share something about him in a real way. And I think that was the way for him to do it, to bring you into his home, into his studio, not sort of just shoot the shit on Sunset Strip somewhere.
Yeah. He had, was it Steve Brown of Trickster was one of the guys that I talked to who was there. Damon Johnson, who's one of my good friends I grew up with, was invited up. They all have talked about going up there and being with Ed, and Ed, blowing them out of the room with his speakers. They all say that. Everybody says that about the visit. There was another thing that I read from Sash Jordan about her being over there for a few days. I don't know when this was exactly, but this was, I think, after he passed, and she was talking about running the Ralphs down the street at like, I don't know, 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning. And Andrew Bennett, who you guys referenced as well in your book, had a similar story of Ed going outside of the compound down into the public, and he didn't really relish that at all, apparently, because he just felt like he was going to get attacked, I guess. Just overwhelmed with things like you were talking about, where you couldn't have a real situation to talk. And he would take them down there, and then he would get overwhelmed at 2 o'clock in the morning by people trying to talk to him or whatever. Why, he just seemed like that was very uncomfortable to him, and he made that comment to both of them that this is why I can't go anywhere. Did he feel trapped at 5150? I mean, obviously he liked being there, but there was
I don't think he felt trapped. I think and he did get out. I mean, I know in the latter years, he talked about stuff like it was in my tribute in Guitar World after he passed. I just told a little anecdote that he passed on to me about, I remember at 5150, he had, and I think it's in one of the pictures I sent you, but he had this huge Dodge 1947 cab over truck that you can't miss. It's this vintage truck. It's painted bright red. It's Van Halen colors. And that's why he bought it, right. And he would drive this huge behemoth down the hill to go buy groceries and to make runs to Home Depot. Right. And I think he just kind of didn't care. Okay. And I think in a way he kind of got a kick out of it, and he said I was pulling out of the grocery store one day and the truck broke down, and there's all this traffic backed up because it was just, it was like it's always the wrong time of the day in the Valley anyways. Right. But it's just like, it was one of the big major 3 streets and all this traffic's backed up and there's this huge truck and you can't just get out and push that thing out of the way. Right. You got to wait for the tow truck to show up. He says, and meanwhile, here I am, Eddie Van Halen. The truck's already creating a commotion. And the fact that it's Eddie Van Halen with this big truck, but he's like, what are you going to do? You got to live.
Right.
But
5150
was. I don't think he felt trapped by 5150. Though.
No, not at all.
I think he felt comfortable there, and he was happy that he had it. And
it was his happy place.
Right.
Yeah, it was his happy place.
So, but his social anxiety didn't bother him when he was in public and people were approaching him constantly, or.
Nah, see, I don't know. I didn't sort of see it that way. I think he was able to understand that. It's more what we're talking about is, sort of general social situations that most of us take for granted, just casual interactions with other people. I mean, he was elevated because he was a rock musician and he had a lot of people coming up to him, and he was being forced constantly into social situations to promote and to do all these things. Right. And that was never a very comfortable experience for him. And as a result, we hear about, it's no secret that Ed had problems with, substance abuse, whether that was alcohol or cocaine or some of these other things.
Right.
And the fact that he had to live a social life, he had to. That was part of the gig, right?
Sure.
So in order to make himself feel comfortable, he would lean into the bottle,
Right.
And that's where really, it would have been better if he would have had more help with that early on. But, mental health issues have become, more accepted, less of a stigma attached than it was back in the 70s or 80s or even the 90s,
Sure.
Maybe if he had gotten some therapy to help with those issues, he would have been around a lot longer. But
Yeah, I remember, in the 80s, this was something I saw every year with Nam because I was around during those things, and it seemed like he got more and more uncomfortable with those situations at Nam, and he saw that anxiety in him sometimes.
Well, they're crazy. I mean, Van Halen fans can be kind of nuts, it can be overwhelming, and people they want their piece of him, and they want his time, and he can't accommodate everybody. He was really good at accommodating people. I saw him in the latter years, whether it was in Atlanta in the hotel lobby at the Four Seasons, and some people would come up and ask him for an autograph. There was one guy who came up with a guitar, and he obliged and signed it, and he was good with that, but it was just, NAMM especially is just overwhelming. I mean, I know, Kevin Dugan, I know him really good. And if I saw him at NAMM, I just knew to get out of the way because usually he was out there, being Michael Anthony's bodyguard. Sure. And it was just like, can't talk, got to watch Mike, stay away, because it's overwhelming. You're crushed by these people. And I've seen that with pretty much anybody of any renown at NAMM show, where they become different people when they're surrounded by this crush of people all trying to get their attention, Yeah.
Hey, Jeff. So are you referring to that time at NAMM where Ed, sort of famously had a bit of a meltdown?
Was it with Peavy?
Yeah. It's on YouTube, but that was also due to other circumstances that are covered in the book.
Yeah.
There was a period in Ed's life where, he was on shaky ground, psychologically, substance-wise, health issues. There was a lot of things coming down on him at one time. And that's the difficulty of being a public figure, right?
Sure.
There's no time out, you have to keep on that. And Ed wasn't doing great at that period.
Sure.
And one of the things that we tried to do in the book was that people will tend to laugh at that or mock him because of that, that guy's all fucked up or whatever that they're going to say online about it.
Sure.
But, for us, it was super important not only to cover the good times and the rise and the instruments and everything, but to help people also understand that at the core, Ed was a human being.
Sure.
And there were moments in his life where his life got extremely difficult for him and it became overwhelming.
Yeah.
And he is just a human being.
Yeah, I remember that, you're the 2004 era, the 2006, right through that whole period, and your book does cover that in quite a good bit of detail. And I think we all were afraid for Ed, physically, because we all loved him so much. And
there was a reason for it, and it was and those were serious reasons.
Oh yeah, they were. Yeah. And I knew a lot of the things surrounding those issues, and I think everybody in the music business knew those things. I think everybody.
Yeah, but Ed was trying. He was trying to work through all that stuff.
Totally. Let me ask you this question. Well, let's talk about the Frankenstein and take a little break for a minute from that stuff and go to the back to you. Let's talk about the Frankenstein weight, feel, again, like you were talking about before we got started. I have this from the Play It Loud exhibition.
Cool.
Which I took myself at the exhibition. And you had a book called Play It Loud, right? This is based on, is that right?
Yeah, I did. It was the exhibition at the Met was based on a a book that I wrote about the history of the electric guitar. And the guy's putting together the exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, which is, probably one of the world's most famous art exhibits, was moved by the book and thought it would make a great idea for an exhibition. And I have to say, it was really an incredible experience and really one of the most fantastic exhibitions I've ever seen.
Right.
They did such a great job. I wasn't involved in all the nuts and bolts of it,
Right.
I was more of, they used the book as a foundation and I was a consultant. But oh my God. I mean, the Frankenstein was there and Keith Richards Telecaster and Stevie Ray Vaughan Stratocaster and Jimmy Page's entire Led Zeppelin rig. And,
I was trying to tell somebody, but I said, just imagine this. You walk in, you see the Frankenstein, Hendrix's V, Jimmy Page's number one. You got Prince's guitar behind you. You got the Blackie behind that. This is all within a tiny space.
Dwayne Allman's guitars,
Stevie Ray Vaughan, all like you said, and Jimmy Page was so well represented. It was, I grew up watching Song Remains the Same, so to see the dragon suit and all that, I was like,
yeah,
I cannot believe I'm here and seeing this stuff. It was a fantastic experience for me.
Very exciting. Yeah,
I just flew there just for that, and it was awesome. So thanks for your involvement and kind of spurring that on. That's just an amazing thing. But the weight of this guitar you were talking about earlier. My friend Matt Wake, who's a journalist here in town, was asking this question, and you guys said in another interview it was a lot less heavy to a 70 Strat, but more like a standard Strat. Is that right?
Yeah, it's just I think that's the thing. I know somebody had reached out to Jazz Obrecht, and I know Jazz. I worked with him, a guitar player, and I think from his perspective, he said it was a light guitar.
Yeah, right.
And it's not really like what I would personally think of a light, but I think Jazz was thinking of it in the 70s perspective, because what did you have in the late 70s? You had these concrete Les Pauls,
right,
and you had these boat anchor Strats,
Sure, right.
And those are pretty heavy. So compared to those at the time, it's, yes, the Frankenstein is light, but to a modern day perspective where we have some really featherweight guitars out there, or even you have, like a 50s Telecaster that's properly aged and everything in swamp ash, it's going to be barely 5 pounds. My best guess on the weight, and this is circa 2013 when I got to hold it in my hands, is that it's about 6.5 to the low 7s, like 7 pounds, a few ounces. That's my best guess. I don't have Ed's built-in, weight gauge, basically, like he could tell you things what it weighed to the ounce, which is just uncannily amazing. But it was a decently heavy, but not overly heavy guitar. So it was probably
I thought it was pretty substantial. I mean, I picked it up and played a few notes on it, and yeah, it struck me as substantial guitar.
Yeah.
Right. After he drilled 8 million holes in it, and nearly, you look at it in the case, there's all these giant holes in where he put the eye hooks, and it just trashed the thing, man. But you guys said it had like a character with the striping and all that the texture you were talking about earlier before we got started. You were talking about the texture. Talk about that.
Well, there's all these layers of paint, as we know, so there's that. Then there's the wear and tear. So there's all this exposed wood grain in parts. There's chips of paint. Brad saw, Ed take the guitar and just chuck it into the back of a truck. No case or anything, just threw it.
We were going to a photo shoot, and I said, Ed, you got to bring some guitars. And so he grabs, Frankenstein by the neck and a couple of other guitars, no cases, nothing. Goes back to the pickup truck that he was driving to the photo shoot, and just sort of like heaves it over over the side. I still don't know whether he was trying to shock me or whether that was just normal behavior, but it definitely caught my attention.
Right. Wolfgang talks about that in some of these interviews where his dad would handle that guitar like that. He wouldn't even think twice about handling it. They were like, oh no, even the family was scared to throw that thing around. They got to, even Wolfie's kind of like in awe of that guitar.
Well, the battle scars are just amazing and they're real. That's what's so great about it. It's not some relic job done by some guy, down in a factory somewhere. I'm sure Ed could tell you a story behind every ding and dent in that thing. Maybe not. Maybe because there were so many of them, he probably forgot where they came from. Right. But it was just, I've seen Rory Gallagher's Strat and obviously Stevie Ray Vaughan's, and you think of those as worn guitars. But man, Ed's guitar is on a whole other level. Like you said, all the holes drilled in it, all the experimentation stuff that went on. How many times did he change tail pieces? How many times did he change the pick guard? Just all this stuff. I mean, it's just amazing. It's like this map of just this guy like never settling in. It's never good enough.
Right. I think, Chris, you made the point. Recently Les Paul's guitar came up for auction. The one that Les actually used. Right. And it's sort of the same way because Ed and Les were spiritual. Yeah, brothers.
That's the thing. Yeah, Christie's is auctioning off. It's the very first Les Paul. It's one of the two that Gibson made. And I know this because I know Tom Doyle. I know he's not BSing on this. I know this is for the genuine article. It is the number one Les Paul, and Les hacked that thing up to bits. He rotted parts out of it. He stuck a dummy pickup in there. He swapped pickups out. He was not sentimental about that guitar. It wasn't like, oh, this is the first one with my name on it. I'm going to put it away in a case over here. And you can't touch it. You can't look at it, No, it was just like, hey, Tom, hand me that guitar. Hey, Tom, why don't you do this? Hey, I'm just going to dig this out here so we can put this in here to kill the hum, whatever. Wow. Ed was the same way.
Yeah, he cut that horn off that SG just to do the slide part in that one song, right?
Just like, hey, it's getting in my way. Hand me a hacksaw, zip,
Well, I always thought that was really funny, that story in particular. There's another thing that I want to ask you guys about. You played through the Marshall, the famous Marshall, right?
Yeah. Okay. I did. Yeah.
So was it your typical super lead gain-wise, and was it all volume that he achieved that sound with, or his hands?
I can speak to that. So
Chris might do better. Like when I had the opportunity, believe me, it was short. Like I messed around with it for a couple of minutes, but to be honest with you, as thrilling as it was, and as cool as it was to hear it, and it did it was a serious sounding amplifier.
Right.
Oh, you go play some shit in front of Eddie Van Halen.
No thanks.
I tried to pull out a few things that I could do that were maybe a little bit different, and played a couple of power chords, and then I was like, oh, take it back.
Right.
My take, guitar nerd alert. Okay. Going to get technical here.
Go for it.
I didn't have the opportunity to play through it. I did see a note in tape that we were not allowed to photograph about how the Variac was to be used with the head, which I will say Pete Thorne's right on it. It's basically, he dropped it down to about 89, 90 volts, and then the amp is biased for that voltage. Mm-hmm. That's part of the key, number one. Number two, 6CA7 tubes. They have a different characteristic than your EL34. Sylvania 6CA7 tubes. I lived in Southern California at the time. I had amps with EL34s, and that was the tube that you got. And you went down to the drugstore and you bought them, or you went down to the TV repair shop and you bought them. That's what you got, 6 Sylvanias. They worked out great for Ed's character. They have a little bit higher clean headroom, but they can also, when you get them over the edge, they break up in a very interesting type of way, and it's really cool, and it really worked for what the sound that we know of Ed. The other thing, people talk about those low Zower shots for Van Halen 2 in the studio. They say there's a shaft in the back, and you can see a hole in the back of that Marshall that's plugged up with a screw. My theory, and the funny thing is I asked Ed about that, and he just kind of changed the subject, but he insisted it wasn't a master volume. It wasn't any special modification or anything. Mm-hmm. I wish you would have just explained this, because I'm thinking it was just a simple bias adjustment, because that was part of it, because he was constantly blowing tubes out and whatever and replacing them. And when you had it hooked up to the Variac, he wanted just a quick and easy way to adjust the bias. So that's my theory. I don't know for sure if that's true or not, but that's my theory. I don't think Jose modified it. I think Jose repaired the amp, because we know early on Ed talks about blowing the amp up. I don't know if it made it into the book or hit the cutting room floor, but Ed had talked about, like he found Jose like right away. He was just a local repair guy. Right. That, someone just recommended, and he took it there. And basically Ed, I think, blew up the transformer for some reason. And, so Jose replaced it. And obviously caring enough about a Marshall, probably got close enough to spec or whatever that was proper. And we know there's like a capacitor of some sort in there that's not to spec. But then you're talking about Marshalls in that era, they got whatever parts they could. So there's going to be variances. But then again, the Ed overdrive, that's the risk.
I love it. I love it when Chris talks dirty like this.
Tubes, man.
But people talk about, I plugged into a plexi and it's not this. And it's like, well, because you're not Ed.
Right.
It's just, that's the biggest part missing. But you're probably also missing some of these little subtle details. But at the end of the day, it was Ed.
Right. 68.7s are like 65.50s, right?
Yeah, they're close to that. They're a little bit softer than a 65.50.
Okay.
But they do have that, they're tighter, and they have a little bit higher headroom. They don't compress as much as Neil 34 does. It's a livelier sound.
Yeah.
And that's, I think a lot of people talk about plugging into a plexi, but it's like, yeah, but did you retube it? Did you put the variac at the right thing? Did you rebias the amp for 90 volts, not for 110 or 120? You got to remember too, like 110 was the voltage in the US for many years before it got pumped up to 120.
Right.
So there's all these factors.
Right. So one of the things that I've always wanted to know, and maybe you guys know the answer to this, I don't know, this may be just totally crazy, but why, if he loved his Marshall so much, did he never do any kind of signature deal with Marshall?
I think it's why he initially didn't do any deal with Fender or Gibson or whatever. I think, one, Marshall probably never asked him. And by the time I think Marshall probably caught up to thinking to ask him about it, he had already had the deal worked out with Peavey. Yeah. The music industry was very, very slow to react to this incredible phenomenon, the golden child of the guitar industry. Right. I think they thought they could get along without him. I mean, my God, Charvel put out an Eddie Van Halen model. Yeah. Without asking Ed, hey, can we do this? They just did it. Yeah. That burned Ed up so bad.
Yeah, when I was reading your book about, this whole progression towards his commercialism of his products, I remember a time early on when I was thinking, why doesn't he do this? Way back. It was like in the book, you guys kind of go through this with him, and he talks about it. It kind of took him a minute to with Kramer and all that, it was like it took him a minute to kind of accept that. Like he didn't really want to do it at first.
Yeah. I think, that's the thing. I think he liked having his individual thing. He liked having something that nobody else had. Okay. That was a big part of who Eddie Van Halen was. He wasn't a guy to go copy other people's licks and sound like somebody else. He was Eddie Van Halen. He was going to do what he did. Right. But back to the Marshall thing, the other thing I just was thinking while we were talking about this, the amps that Marshall was making in the 80s and the 90s didn't appeal to Ed. Right. He liked his plexi, and Marshall wasn't going to turn around and make. Yeah, at that point, they weren't into looking back. Sure. Marshall was pushing forward with new designs and stuff like that, and that didn't appeal to Ed at all. Right.
Yeah, the whole MI musical instrument industry thing was going under so many transitions back then. Back in the early 70s. And a lot of them weren't very good. They were a product of corporate think, as opposed to really listening to the boots on the ground, so to speak. Sure. So that's sort of what, Ed's whole thing was almost a response to how awful everything was in the marketplace. Sure. That's why he had to build his own guitar. Right. Because he really couldn't find one that he liked. Right. If he found a company that had made a guitar that he liked, he would have probably played it. He wouldn't have thought twice about it. But there was sort of the dark ages in terms of how things were being built, and then these guys that were running it the corporate guys were pretty much tone deaf. They had a tin ear. That's why you had to have these scrappy guys like Kramer, which is a smaller company that had their ear to the ground a little bit more, come in and actually approach Ed.
Right. So I guess we should give them some credit for starting that trend then.
Yeah.
Be a little more
absolutely
connected.
The other thing was, it's interesting because you did see like Gibson, obviously the Les Paul is a perfect example. Here was a signature model, and Gibson continued to pursue signature models up until like Norland bought them out. And all of a sudden they got in a bunch of accountants and number crunchers. And they're like, what are we paying these guys extra money for? We can just make guitars, whatever. We can just get some people to endorse them. We don't actually need to pay them royalties and stuff. And I think that was the mentality because things got so big, Fender being owned by CBS.
Right.
It just they were like looking at the bottom line and like, let's just get rid of these musicians. We don't pay them extra money. So we'll just do it ourselves or whatever and let them follow along. I think that was really
after you guys out there buy this book,
right?
The Eruption Conversations with Eddie Van Halen,
October 5th.
After you buy this one,
right? Read that,
and you want to know about why Eddie Van Halen had to build his own guitar. You can go to Play It Loud, my other book, which explains the whole messiness of the 70s.
One of the funny stories, one of my, Damon's been in Guitar World. Damon Johnson been in Guitar World a couple times, and he was on tour with him in '95. And one of the questions he posed to me to ask you guys was that when he was with Eddie and Eddie was showing him his rig, he was back there and the PV guys happened to be there that day. And he looked down in the rack and he saw the old Marshall in the rack. And he looks at Eddie and he looks at the Marshall and Eddie goes, and that's all he did. And so the Marshall apparently was on the road in '95. Do you guys know if it continued on the road after that?
I don't think it did because I think that was about the point where Ed retired the amp. Okay. He was just like, okay, this thing is getting a little bit tired here.
Right.
And I don't know of any. I've done a lot of reconnaissance since then on anything. I mean, I can't tell you about, the tour with Sharon. Maybe it might have appeared there. Possibly it did. But after that, it was pretty much, an ongoing thing with the amps that he endorsed and that sort of thing. And I can definitely say, because in 2012 and 2015, they let me examine every single inch of that stage and take pictures and take notes, especially in 2015. And it was all EVH gear, right. Except for a few little extra items, power conditioners, some effects, that sort of thing.
Right. You'll go back to Eddie and his personality too. One of the things we were talking about where he would call people or he'd let people come up to the 5150. He would also make random calls to people. like the guest that was just on my last, or that's going to be on my next episode. He was there in the studio. He grabbed his phone because his son didn't come and called his son up just randomly and left him a message.
Cool.
He just did stuff like that, I guess. There was another story about him at Guitar Center where he was in there and somebody asked, this kid was asking about what kind of mic he should get to mic his amp. And he said, maybe you should ask this guy. And it was Ed. And Ed goes, you should get a 57. And then he bought him the 57. The caveat to that was the next day the kid brought it back and traded it back in. This is a crazy story, apparently from the Guitar Center that was close to his house there. But anyway, one of the things in your book.
Let's clarify this. We talked about how Ed was a bit of an introvert and a homebody, if you will. But as a human being, he was incredibly warm once you got him, sort of one-on-one.
Right.
And he knew how much his fans loved him.
Right.
And, he wasn't against reciprocating that, you know what I mean? He didn't like it, and he was a prankster and he had a great sense of humor and he, one-on-one again, he was terrific. He wasn't like a shut down person.
Sure.
It's just this sort of people grabbing at him in this sort of cocktail sort of conversation that was the thing that just sort of freaked him out. that kind of light banter that you're forced into in social situations, or
sure.
Dealing with record company executives and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, he didn't. Apparently, in your book, he tried to stay out of that. He didn't want to know about it. He didn't want to know about it.
Yeah.
He didn't want to know about any of that. Said it multiple times in there that he would just leave me alone with all that. Let me do my thing, and he had let other people handle it.
Yeah.
So in your musical interludes, which were including Michael Anthony, which I thought was a great interview with him, Steve Vai, Gary Cherone, and Ray Daniels, Michael was an interesting contrast between him and Ray. He wasn't as easy on Ray as I expected him to be, and Ray's conversation was pretty frank and I thought clear to what his situation was. And Gary, a lot of this Van Halen 3 talk that's in the book, there's a lot more to that story that you guys cover that's never really been fleshed out. And Gary fleshes it out a lot in this book, too. I thought that was a very interesting part of this book, that Van Halen 3 discussion. Obviously the backlash with the album and how it didn't go as well. But yeah, the story, Ray Daniels and Sammy Hagar and all those troubles, and Michael kind of siding with Sammy against Ray, but then Ray's story seemed very, normal and
yeah. I mean, look, I think the biggest problem with Ray and maybe the band and everything was that Ray was based in Canada, and he was the manager for Rush as well.
Yeah,
and the Van Halen camp, it just was the case, whether it was Sammy or whether it was Ed or Michael, they were just used to managers that were very hands-on,
right,
and very day-to-day. And, their previous manager to Ray Daniels, Ed Loeffler, was a father figure to them.
Right.
There's no question, he was very, oversaw their daily lives, was there when they needed a shoulder to cry on. It was a very personal relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And Ray, when he was brought on, he was much more thinking in terms of like a traditional manager. Like he was there to help them with their business dealings, try to find the best sort of deals for them, and try to figure out what's best for the band. But he wasn't really that sort of father figure. And I think while Ed Loeffler was managing the band, he was able to manage any personal problems and get them to talk, because he was, again, there sort of every day. And he was originally Sammy's manager.
Right.
So I think a lot of the confusion about Ray and what he brought to the band and his intentions was more because he wasn't that sort of hands-on kind of guy. He was more of a straight-up business guy.
Yeah, and he kind of said that in not so many words there, especially at the end of that conversation.
And he was a little shocked, to be honest, by how kooky those guys all were, how eccentric, or however you want to put it,
right.
Especially coming from Rush,
right.
Who were very reasonable, friendly individuals.
Right.
I don't think he was quite prepared to deal with it.
Right, with the wildness